healthcare needs to become more sustainable for a lot of reasons. We specifically looked at the greenhouse gas emissions in our report, but as a lot of our listeners are probably aware, healthcare contributes a massive proportion of emissions globally. So the rough estimate is about 4 to 5% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the health sector. If you then unpack where those emissions within the health system comes from, a large proportion of it comes from the supply chain, and of that supply chain, a large proportion comes from the pharmaceuticals.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. This is the show where we share tools and tactics about decarbonizing the healthcare industry. My name is Frederik van Deurs. I'm the CEO in Green Innovation Group, and today I have two amazing guests with me. They have produced a piece of knowledge or content, a report that outlines how the industry can help reduce its emissions, how far it is on track to do so. And there's been a lot of findings in there that I found quite interesting. So that's why I invited Amy and Chris to be on the show. So Amy and Chris, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. The pleasure to be here.
Great to be with you.
And for our listeners that are not familiar with you and your work, maybe you'll go ahead and introduce yourself. Amy, maybe you can start off.
Sure, absolutely. So as you mentioned, my name's Amy. I am actually a medical doctor trained in South Africa. So I completed my training there, worked for a few years in the health system, and happened to be working during the COVID pandemic. And I think that completely shifted my viewpoint on how we practice healthcare and how damaging it can be for the environment. We just produced so much PPE waste at the time. So that prompted me actually to leave clinical medicine, and I came across to the University of Oxford, where I am now working in the research space. So I'm doing my PhD and particularly looking at, as you mentioned, how the pharmaceutical industry is engaging with its greenhouse gas emissions and how we can get it to the point where it is reducing those emissions very well.
Thanks, Amy. And my name's Chris Winchester. I'm CEO of Oxford Pharmagenesis, and we're a healthcare communications consultancy working with many of the leading pharmaceutical companies around the world. And so for us, we were starting to see some questions about how we should be responding from our clients. And so it was really helpful to dig into that a bit more with Amy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just a tremendous challenge. So I'm just going to pick a little bit up on that. So Chris, is it correct? Oxford Pharmagenesis, right? That's the name of the company. It's a consultancy where you lift primarily communications assignments for pharma companies. What could be examples that you're lifting?
So we help to communicate their results to different audiences. So it's evidence-based communication. It spans anything from helping to get clinical trials published in medical journals, through to organizing submissions of why a new drug's worth paying for to bodies like the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE in the UK, or other bodies that are trying to work out to look at value for money for new medicine. It could even be running virtual meetings or face-to-face meetings, and we're increasingly engaged with data analytics and health informatics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a lot on the communication side, but also in the very sort of hardcore specialized side communication, where you have something that is very specific that needs to be communicated to someone else who has that sort of prior understanding of the space.
Yeah,
that's
right.
That's got to be really interesting job to have.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, we employ a lot of people, very talented people with PhDs and postdocs in the biosciences who can really delve into the data and then come out of the detail again and think what's important and what's important for a particular audience to know and understand, and how do we communicate it in words that they can relate to.
And is that primarily in the UK, or do you cater to clients all over the globe?
Most of our clients are abroad, actually. So our main offices are in the UK. We have 500 employees now, and 400 are in the UK. We've got 80 in the US and about 20 in other places, Melbourne and Australia, New Zealand, etc. So, but our client base is where global pharmaceutical companies are based. So that's a lot in the US, a lot in New Jersey or Boston, a lot in Switzerland, even a few clients in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, there's I can think of at least one potential client in the UK who could lean on those kinds of services. That's super cool. Thanks a lot for introducing and also giving a little bit. I like having that context so our listeners know, what is it they actually do and how can we learn from them. And I think you made that very clear. So thanks a lot for that. I know that there's an origin story as to how you two met, and I know how we met because I saw your content on LinkedIn, and I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I reached out after seeing it. But I'm curious to hear your origin story. How did you two cross paths initially?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm doing my PhD looking at how the pharmaceutical industry is tackling its greenhouse gas emissions. And the University of Oxford is a very interesting place, but it's basically broken down into colleges. And I happen to be a student at Green Templeton College, where Chris happens to be a fellow. So my supervisor put us into touch because she knew that I was interested in the pharmaceutical space, and Chris was, CEO of Oxford Pharmagenesis. And so we had a really interesting coffee conversation. And Chris, I don't know what your so we went from there.
I know, it was wonderful, really. I mean, I was lucky enough to be invited to join Green Templeton College in Oxford as an associate fellow. And Green College was the medical college. It merged with the business college, Templeton College. So pharmaceuticals ought to be somewhere in the middle there. But academia can be a bit sort of suspicious of pharmaceutical companies. And so, I think Green Templeton did see the opportunity to bring in someone with that experience. And what they talk about is bringing in practitioners, so that academics can meet practitioners. And I think we're a fantastic case study of that, because we were wondering, as I mentioned, right, well, pharmaceutical companies are starting to talk about the environment. What does that mean for us? We're an important part of the supply chain. Amy was thinking, right, how do I understand what's going on in pharma? Who could give me a bit of a sense of how pharmaceutical companies are approaching this and their perspective? And so I think it was a fantastic collaboration.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we both came to that meeting with similar questions, but just from different perspectives. And thus our research was born.
Super cool. Thanks a lot for sharing that story and also for showing that, these changes and these sort of developments in knowledge are basically possible because you have had the boldness and the curiosity to go and investigate more and to spread that knowledge. And I find something I found in this industry is that there's a lot of, you could say, myths and belief systems up and running. When you talk to the practitioners in the hospital, it's like the medtech companies and the pharma companies, they're just trying to sell us stuff. And in the pharmaceutical worlds, they're like very cautious about what they communicate externally because they're under such hard scrutiny that they're, we call it the greenwashing fear, that, they almost don't dare engaging in projects because they're afraid of getting scrutinized and accused of doing something that they're really not trying to do. They're just, trying to do the right thing. And I think when you come into this industry as an outsider, what you notice is that everyone seems to have very big hearts. Even the ones with the worst reputation, the salespeople, the traveling salespeople that are going to the GPs, pushing products, they're super good people. They're like the nicest people you can think of. And when we, of course, always talk about the environment and the global warming issues that come with that, and they are just very conscientious. And they're frustrated that they don't know how to address that and how to position their product in accordance to what they're actually doing. And if a lot of the leaders and the ones that you're outlining in your report is the ones that have sort of scope 3 reporting as an ongoing process. I mean, no one figured out Scope 3 yet, but the ones that are the most advanced, I find often a reluctance to integrate that commercially. So the salespeople are actually not allowed to, talk about the ongoing work as an in-progress process that's going on that could help them position their product as one that, at least they have more transparency in the consequences that are associated to the product. But that there's that, as you said, Chris, there's like a skepticism and a scrutiny from the outside that I think has led to sort of a very careful approach to communication. That means that very little is sort of talked about, even though there's so much to be proud of. And the ones that are at the frontier are just doing so many cool projects that, I sometimes just wish that I could get the, one of those billboards at the New York Times Square and, just announce cool stuff that we've done with clients, but that we're not allowed to share.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics in there. And then while all of this exists at the same time, while all of this is true at the same time, there's always that patient that's the center of that discussion. And that patient needs to have a safe and efficient treatment. And that's why all of us are here and we're putting together this huge orchestra across nations and across the globe and across supply chains that are there for that patient. And I think those two things really shine through when you talk to healthcare professionals. They really care about the patient and they really have big hearts. As sort of a general rule that I've observed in my work here. But I'm digressing. Let's dive into the report. First of all, what's the title of the report? Where can we find it? And why is this report important?
The title of the report is Pharmaceutical Company Targets and Strategies to Address Climate Change, the content analysis of public reports from 20 pharmaceutical companies. And we can unpack that title a little bit as we go forward, I'm sure. But it's published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. So if you type that in, should be easily able to find it on the web.
Super cool. And we will, of course, include it in the show notes with the link and everything. So it's discoverable, just in the case you didn't have the photographic memory in order to put in all of the keywords in the phone while you're listening. So why is this report important?
So, I mean, you've probably spoken about this quite a bit on your podcast, but healthcare needs to become more sustainable for a lot of reasons. We specifically looked at the greenhouse gas emissions in our report, but as a lot of our listeners are probably aware, healthcare contributes a massive proportion of emissions globally. So the rough estimate is about 4 to 5% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the health sector. And that ranges, depending on which country you look at and which article you read. But for a single industry, that's massive. If you then unpack where those emissions within the health system comes from, a large proportion of it comes from the supply chain. And of that supply chain, a large proportion comes from the pharmaceuticals that are purchased and used within health systems. So we're based in the UK, and the NHS's carbon footprint estimates that about 20% of its emissions comes from medicines and chemicals, an additional 5% from anesthetic gases and inhalers. And that value that comes from pharmaceutical emissions goes up. So, for example, in China, the rough estimate is that 55% of its carbon footprint, its healthcare carbon footprint, comes from pharmaceuticals. So I think what we really found interesting was what is being done about that massive impact. And, you can look at it across the spectrum. You can look at it upstream. So what is the industry doing? You can look at it from a procurement perspective, at a prescribing perspective. But we specifically chose in our article to look at what the industry is doing to tackle that proportion of it. And as you mentioned before, this agenda requires all stakeholders to come on board and to make healthcare more sustainable, including suppliers.
So you made this report where you're looking at the Scope 3, so all of the emissions that the pharmaceutical companies have that are not coming from their fuel consumption on their own sites. So everything they get from their own suppliers. And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because the pharmaceutical company is a scope 3 emission for the healthcare system. So for NHS in the UK, their scope 3 emissions are the drugs and medicines that they take on. And those come from, of course, the pharmaceutical companies. So for the pharmaceutical companies to be able to report the associated emissions to their products, they need to map their own supply chain and understand what are the emissions that are associated from producing our product in order to be able to report it to the NHS or other payers in other systems. So when you did this analysis, how many companies were you looking at?
So we looked at the top 20 companies by revenue in 2020. So a large proportion of your sort of branded pharmaceutical companies. And yes, as you rightly said, we looked at scope 3. We did also include scope 1 and 2 because that forms, the entirety of a company's carbon footprint. But yeah, as you rightly say, the scope 3 of health systems is the carbon footprint of pharmaceutical companies, and their scope 3 are all the emissions of their suppliers. So it does become very challenging from an accounting perspective. But yes, we looked at the top 20 companies by 2020 revenue.
And how did you make that distinction between pharma and medtech? Some of them have an intersection. Did you make a conscious scoping of that, or did you just?
So we included all of the top 20, whether they had different branches and arms. We do note that as a limitation of our study, though. So it's very difficult to differentiate between the different branches within a company because they generally report their emissions as a set value, as opposed to breaking it down. So that could definitely be seen as a limitation in that sense.
Yeah, particularly a company like J&J where they have, more of a range. Some other companies are much more focused. But overall, it was nice to see the range. Within the top 20, we had 9 companies headquartered in the US, 8 in Europe, 2 in Japan, and 1 in Israel. And 18 of those are what you would call sort of branded pharma, 2 or generics. So that was quite a bit of a spread. I mean, the other thing that's interesting is just thinking about the ownership and whether that has an impact, so 19 were publicly listed, although one of those is majority owned by a foundation, a charitable foundation, which is focused on sustainability, among other things, and one of them is privately owned, a family company. So, we're also just trying to see how that all fits together.
Yes.
Yeah, no, and of course, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here also because we're so early days in the process that all knowledge right now is actually good knowledge because we're learning as we go, of course. But I find it super interesting that you put up a methodology and you decided, okay, we're running with top 20 by revenue, and then we're reviewing. You had a process of how you reviewed it. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what was the method of doing this assessment?
Yeah, so once we'd chosen our companies, we then went onto each of their websites and accessed their reporting. So companies, obviously, as you'll be aware, have to report an annual report where they disclose their financial information and governance and other information. But a lot of companies have also started including environmental data in that under what we call environment, social governance reporting. And so we basically went onto their website and extracted all their reports that mentioned greenhouse gas emissions. And we ended up extracting data from a total of 86 reports across the 20 companies. So each company reported their emissions in a variety of ways. Some included it in their annual reporting. Others created an integrated report. Some had separate reports for corporate social responsibility and ESG data. Others produced infographics or policy documents and position statements. So really there was a range of sources of this data. And then we basically extracted the data that we wanted to answer our question. So this was information on what targets pharmaceutical companies were setting in terms of climate change. So generally either a pledge to carbon neutrality, net zero, or reducing their emissions by a certain percentage. We looked at what emissions they were reporting, So whether they were reporting scope 1, 2, and 3, what the values were, and whether they'd made any progress on reducing those emissions from their reporting period. And then we looked at what strategies they were implementing to reduce these emissions. So a lot of the companies will report sort of case studies of initiatives that they're implementing, actions that they're taking to really meet these targets and to reduce their emissions. And then we basically just summarize this in a way that we hope readers could easily be able to access.
And thanks a lot for elaborating that, because I think there's a lot of questions that come to mind for me now, because 86 reports, that's a lot of reports. But I think for me and Chris, we're used to getting a report like that and then probably giving a light read often, and then sometimes getting the time to dive in. But we seldom sort of get that joy of actually reading through the details. But once you do, quite often what you'll stumble upon, at least as a sustainability professional in these reports, is that if I had to say something about industry reporting in general in the ESG area, it's that there has not been a very strict methodology. There's not been a uniform way of reporting. And the greenhouse gas protocol actually put a change into that. And I've seen you mention something somewhere about the different reporting categories that the different actors have reported on. So maybe you can walk us through the greenhouse protocol and how these categories are put together, just so everyone understands what we're talking about. But I'm just super curious about it. Did you actually manage to find that from all of them, or did some of them not go into specifics? Maybe you can walk us through the setup here.
Sure. Well, I completely agree with you in what you're saying, that there is very little standardization of reporting across companies. There are definitely attempts to stick to sort of consistent frameworks. So, for example, the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. But in terms of reporting actual emissions, as you say, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol revolutionized that. And in our study, at least, all of the 20 companies used that to report on their emissions. But within that protocol, as you pointed out, there are different categories. So there's scope 1, which looks at your direct emissions from within your operations. There's scope 2 that looks at your indirect emissions from energy purchase. And then there's scope 3, which is basically everything else, as you'll know. And there's 15 categories within that. So capital goods and services, distribution, waste, employee travel, business travel.
So I'm just going to pause you here. So scope 1 and 2, there's actually pretty strict demands of what you include in the reporting. And that has to be done in a certain way. The methodology is very strict here, and there's not so many question marks actually. But when we get to scope 3, all of a sudden we have a range of different categories, and it's also voluntary how many categories you're going to report on. If you're going to report on, I think the lower limit is at 5, and the upper limit is of course 100%. How did you find that space, that navigational space, that the organizations? I mean, you could just say, I'm going for the minimum number, and then I'm just going to pass the bar, or am I going, full on Hermione and report on everything in the strictest detail? How did you see that landscape when you started unfolding it?
When we looked across the companies, I think firstly we found that only 14 of them had actually reported their scope 3 emissions. And of those 14, only 11 had done so comprehensively, by which we mean they'd looked across all of the 15 categories. Some companies had only reported business travel, for example, and obviously when we then looked at progress on how these companies had managed to reduce their emissions, those companies had demonstrated quite extensive reduction in their emissions. But then you have to bear in mind that they only reported business travel over a period that included the COVID pandemic. So it was easy to show reductions in business travel.
For sure.
So I think, what we really found was there is a lot of work to be done on really keeping consistent with reporting across those categories, improving the reporting, and also including scope 3 in things like their climate change targets. So we found that quite a few of the companies pledged to carbon neutrality or pledged to net zero, but only within scope 1 and 2. So there's a gap in aiming to reduce their emissions in scope 3 as well. But I think as you mentioned right at the beginning, this is a challenge that every entity experiences with scope 3. It's not, specific to the pharmaceutical industry. And it's something that I think we all need to just work together across industries, academia, and governments to really get this going. I will make one other point, and that's on regulation. So as you mentioned, at the moment, reporting on all of your greenhouse gas emissions is not mandated globally, but there are pockets where regulation is starting to come into play. So, for example, the NHS is starting to roll out its NHS supply roadmap, and it's now going to mandate that companies that supply to it are going to have to report across their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint with a carbon reduction plan. So these regulations are starting to roll out. That should hopefully also, progress this agenda slightly.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really great point, that we're really seeing a shift in demand. And hopefully that will make both make the industry dance a bit more, but also speed up regulation, like we've seen in the EU now, that you can build renewable energy generation faster with some of the new suggestions that are coming through the European Union. Hopefully we can have something similar here, because we see, and I would love to get your perspective on this, Chris, we see a lot of our clients that have a lot of things in the pipeline, particularly in clinical research, where they feel inhibited in changing some of the practices for some that they know will be greener, because they can't necessarily make an evidence claim that it would be safe and sufficient as part of the treatment by, say, substituting a GP consultation with a telemedicine consultation, something like that. So what do you see, what could regulators do without putting the patient at risk that could help speed up this progression in terms of maybe changing a little bit the way we're doing some of the heavy regulation?
Well, I think it's quite exciting when you think what technology can help to achieve. Arguably human ingenuity has caused this problem, but actually can help us solve it as well. So if you think about the carbon footprint of pharmaceutical companies, yes, a lot of it is in R&D. And of course, some of that research and development never leads to a drug that comes onto the market. So it's interesting to think about where those carbon emissions end up. They're probably not going to end up in someone's scope 3 emissions, because they don't go anywhere. But you can think about running clinical trials. Yes, historically, patients have had to travel to centres to be assessed, and that's been dictated by regulation. Actually, as we move, and you can see moves towards more of a telemedicine approach, we may get better attention of people in clinical trials, which means less missing data or fewer dropouts, which means better quality results from clinical trials. We can also increase inclusion. So suddenly people who live hundreds of miles from a hospital or a clinical trial site can take part in a trial. If you're in Alaska, or if you're in a remote part of Africa, perhaps it becomes possible to become part of a trial. You can be monitored remotely. And then maybe there's the possibility to avoid trials, even using what's usually called real-world evidence, but actually looking in established clinical data sets. There's all of our clinical data, all our consultations and treatment is, when we go to see a primary care physician or a specialist, is typically in a database now. So if we can run studies in pre-existing data and show that medicines work and that they have a favorable safety profile, we can avoid doing clinical trials already. And again, we may include people who are hesitant to take part in trials, perhaps lack trust or in healthcare systems or lack the resources to volunteer to take part. We may have better research as a result, or at least complementary to clinical trials. So you can see within research and development, particularly in the development part, plenty of opportunities to reduce the footprint. And then as you come towards the communication angle, when you know you've got something, or when the company thinks it has something that's got potential, it will want to start to talk to people about it, typically around about phase 2, which is when a new drug or vaccine is going into patients for the first time with a particular disease. So yes, I mean, you think about the important role of conferences, the important role historically of paper. You know, we can see a lot of opportunity there. Again, if you communicate mainly through a face-to-face conference, like the American Heart Association or, the European Cancer Organization, then you're actually somewhat disempowering people who can't afford to go to those conferences. So a virtual conference could reduce the carbon footprint while also including people in low and middle income countries, or people who, are not at a stage of their career, not in a position, within the health system where they can get a budget to attend those conferences. So when I get interested is when you see a win-win. Yes, you can increase diversity and inclusion at the same time as reducing the carbon footprint. And so for a company like us, change, means, we're going to have to challenge how we've done things or what we've advised our clients to do in the past. And it creates opportunity for innovation. And I think innovation is the lifeblood of companies, consultancies like ours, as it must be for yours. So it's about getting ready for that and getting into the right mindset.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think you're really putting the nail on the head there, and also lining out that there's so many benefits from it. And currently this system, the way it's structured, is actually insanely wasteful.
Yes.
If we're just looking at the amount of dollars that are put into phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and you look at the failure rate, where one of the key reasons why a clinical trial fails is actually due to patient dropouts.
Yes.
And if we can circumvent that by making it easier for the patient to attend, then we are not sort of wasting all of this knowledge and all of this lab work that we're putting into it. Did you, I'm curious to know, did you from the report get any estimates of sort of the composition of those emissions? How much do you think comes from R&D? Were you able to assess that?
No. So they specifically reported their emissions according to scopes and didn't really break down.
Yeah. It's also a super complex beast to start. Then you have a CRO here, and you have your own internal development, your own labs. It's a tough one to break down.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you had a finding there. Really, really cool. I'm very impressed with this work. If there's one final note that you would like to pass on to the listeners in here, maybe we should get tactical and strategical. If you are working in a company that is struggling with scope 3 or wants to do more, well, what are the actions that they should start taking?
Well, I mean, I can talk a bit about what we've been doing at Oxford Pharmagenesis. I think we started with this research, which really helped inspire us to do more. And so as a first step, we started measuring our carbon footprint. So we appointed an external consultant to help us do that. I think, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And so that's the starting point. And then we've actually taken the step, one of the first companies in our sector to sign up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. So we haven't actually set our target yet. We've just committed to setting a target. We've got a year to work out what that's going to be. We've also joined something called the Sustainable Medicines Consortium, which is a fantastic group of people from all aspects of the health system. And I think talking to other people in the sector, encouraging each other, sharing learnings is something that's really, really important to do. So those are a few as a starter, really.
Yes. I mean, just to add on that, if you do read our paper, we've got, I think, a very nice table of all of the strategies that companies are implementing that I think other companies and other industry members can learn from as well. So there's this sort of low-hanging fruit like renewable energy and increasing energy efficiency in operations. But then there's also some really innovative solutions that companies are engaging with. So things like implementing e-leaflets, so electronic leaflets to go into packaging, take back programs for pharmaceutical agents as well. So I think it would be worth just taking a browse through those initiatives. And then just bearing in mind, as you mentioned right at the beginning, there is so much happening in this space. So reaching out to colleagues within the industry, but also engaging other stakeholders like governments, policymakers, and in my case, academia, because I think we all have to work together if we're going to advance this agenda. And by sharing lessons across the different stakeholder groups, I'm optimistic that we can make some headway.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point. And I mean, right now you can think of it a little bit like an arms race that, you have a lot of different reporting standards that are coming out. I think the one that seems to be having the most momentum right now is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's rather stringent. It's focused on greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't yet have a holistic framework of, for instance, chemical pollution or the social aspects, but I'm sure that will be coming. And then, of course, the ESG reporting will be one system that they are also it's required for them to report on it in most instances, but try and see if there are synergies between the different reporting systems so you can align them and have the carbon accounting tie into the ESG reporting, tie into the SBTI reporting, tie into which other frameworks are being applied in that organization, whether they're committed to net zero or to carbon neutral. A lot of those goals can actually communicate and intersect and implement with one another. So I think it's probably wise not to just marry one framework right now, but stay a little bit open and explorative and see what ends up becoming the winning formula. Because right now it's actually difficult to say 10 years from now what is the one framework that everyone will be reporting within. I don't think anyone can say with certainty that it's going to be this one that will turn into the gold standard. But in Green Innovation Group, at least our position is that CO2 equivalence is very likely to be the environmental currency that we report on, much like we have in our financial statements, we report in euro or dollars. So it becomes a currency that is comparable across industries and geographies. And that's where CO2 equivalence is just a very powerful metric to run with and to start and measure and start challenging yourself on it and say, okay, we don't know what we don't know, but now we're on the path. We're making the moves, and then I would say the strongest thing that I have seen clients do is to integrate with the overall business strategy. If that is done, there's a much higher chance that it will actually succeed. Whereas if it's put in a department on the side, it's going to be very difficult to command the attention from senior management, to demand the attention from executive management, to actually do something about it. And you can usually see if a CEO says that sustainability is on the top 3, you can ask them about the budget and time allocation. And usually you will have that revelation that maybe it wasn't quite the top 3. Maybe we were talking a different structure of how much priority, time and attention we're giving it. And that's quite saying, because if we're looking at the switch in demand, and we're looking at a huge system like NHS that is putting this up as a demand, organizations really have to ask themselves, are we ready for tenders to have this as a strict winning requirement all across the EU and probably also in the US very soon? So I think that's the one question that we really need to push this into the commercial arena for it to get leverage. And I think that's also one of the things that will come out of such a list, that the requirements are coming. So the market is changing, the demands in the market are changing. So you just need to ask yourself if you want to be the one that were late for the supper or the one that arrived slightly before the serving, and then organize accordingly.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think, as you say, there's lots of drivers for this agenda, lots of challenges and lots of work to be done, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the next few years.
Chris and Amy, thank you so much for being here on the show. I hope that you would be happy to come back one day. I learned a lot from this conversation and would love to dive even deeper into some of it, but let's coordinate that. Thanks for being here, and thanks for sharing your knowledge and your work.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Hello, and thank you so much for listening in to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. It really means the world to us that you're listening in and that you're sharing the podcast as much as you're doing already. We are the top 5% most shared podcast on Spotify, and that is just a tremendous honor that you think the content is so good that you would actually share it with your network. So thanks a lot for that. Please remember that if you subscribe and rate the podcast, it makes it easier for us to get interesting people on board and have them guest the podcast and share their insights with you. So if you would please subscribe and rate the podcast, that would mean the world to us. Also, if you have feedback for us, we're always really, really happy to receive it, to listen to it, and to improve on the show and to improve your experience with the show. So thanks a lot for listening in. Have a great day out there.